Welcome to Conflict Managed. I'm your host, Mary Brown. Conflict Managed is a weekly podcast about toxic work environments and how to fix them. We're glad you're here. Good morning, Bud, and welcome to Conflict Managed.
Thanks for having me.
It's so lovely to see you, and I know we're going to have a wonderful conversation about all the interesting things that you are about when it comes to helping organizations live into the future and address reality as given and how we work with change and AI and all of that. But before we get to that, I would like to hear about the first job you ever had as a young person.
Ooh, the first job. That's a good one. I think the first real job I had is I worked at the Gap for the
Mm.
summer in high school. I learned a lot of stuff in that job. I still fold the jeans the correct way, and I will argue with anyone who folds them incorrectly. And that's also strangely, as a young man, where I learned to talk to women because they would put you in the fitting room at different times, and you actually had to like interact. And I grew up a huge nerd, so this was a big skill leap for me as a young man. So it was like great, and like I just remember it being like almost like it what really felt like a family with the different people that you work there. I was surprised how much I enjoyed that job.
That's so great for that to be sort of, sounds like you had some other little jobs before that, but first real job to learn practical skills of how to talk to women in full clothes, but that the environment felt like a family. Now you've been in many different environments since then. What were they getting right? What was going on with the management and everything else?
I think it was a bit of like the average age of the employees was the same. I've also found this like years ago, we were working with a restaurant client, and I got to go pretend to be a waiter for a few weeks and bounce from state to state and like shadow other wait staff. And that also was one of those places where it's like there's a lot of people who are near the same age. There's a lot of camaraderie and things like that. And I think that in both of those cases, like the managers in those organizations, like knew when to step in, but also when to let employees sort of build their own culture in that way. And you just found that people love coming to work for each other, which I think is, something we don't talk enough about. We talk about like big company purpose and perks and benefits and things like that, but most people go to work for their friends at work and for the people they know.
That's such a good point. And I'd love to talk with you about that because when you see a lot, people posting online about, I don't need any more friends. That's not why I'm going to work. And it is a good question. What is work for?
Yeah.
And yet the studies we see that if you have one work friend, let alone three, your job satisfaction, therefore your engagement, there's all these metrics that go up. It's good for the individual, the team, the organization to have these places that we spend most of our waking hours at be places we want to be, people we're looking forward to being with.
Yeah, and I knew the Gallup people, and when they created the famous like 12 Gallup questions that measure employee engagement, they tested that question. So there's a question that says, "Do you have a best friend at work?" And they tested, I think they would say something like 1,400 variations of questions to find the 12 that are the most meaningful. And they tested, that was the one that like every single time they tested it, it was one of the biggest indicators of your engagement at work. And also the one that like people had the most divisive reaction to your point about like, I'm not here to make friends. And I remember oftentimes like bringing in the Gallup 12 questions to organizations who hadn't surveyed engagement before, and almost all tech companies that would really push back on that one. But they also are the ones that have the highest attrition, right? And the hardest time like keeping anyone in the workforce, in their workforce. So I think it's super important. It's just hard, it's hard as a leader to, you can't force those conditions, right?
Right.
Most of the time you're stepping in and like disrupting those kinds of conditions that exist. And there's lots of different reasons that people bond at work. And sometimes they bond over not great stuff. They can bond over gripes. So I understand
Right.
it. But it is really powerful when you have a solid group of peers and colleagues at work, obviously.
Yeah, I'm really interested in, I mean, there's something about, how do you, the ROI on what you're doing, especially if you're in a consultant and you're trying to show that this is actually, it's good for the bottom line, it's good for this, that, and the other matrix. But when it comes to something like that, that's sometimes intangible, like if you're trying to, because you can't force it, trying to get your arms around it. And so it makes us uncomfortable. It's something that we don't know what to really do about. And I think our obsession with numbers can hurt us, and that we have to. Something is only good if it can be measured, and if it can't be measured, this means you don't know how to measure it, right? It's when we take humans and turn them into something that's not human, right? So we are humans at work, and so we've got to figure out. How to deal with the unease we may feel when it's something that we can't control in this sort of matrix sort of way.
I absolutely agree. I once we were in the middle of a big turnaround and we started within one division and we had done enough work that had gotten up to the CEO where he was like, "Oh, what's going on over there? What is this strange thing?" And they're not McKinsey, so why are they here? And so he invited me into his office and he wouldn't make eye contact with me for like the beginning of the conversation. And then he suddenly turned to me and said, "What uh, productivity gain can you guarantee by this work?" And I looked him in the eye and I said, "Okay, how do you measure productivity currently?" And he was stumped because he doesn't. Like, no one was measuring productivity of the process. And I was like, well, that's a good place to start. We can start there and we can start thinking about those things. But if anyone was sitting in my chair and they just told you a number, they were just flat out liars.
Right.
And I was like, well, what I can promise is like usually we aim at an outcome,
Mhm.
right? And sometimes with organizations, that's like we want to be faster, we want to be more collaborative, or we want to be more consumer minded. And we aim at that outcome and try to define like, okay, how would you know if you were moving in that direction or against that direction? And then what do
Mhm.
we think the behaviors are that could produce us like having any momentum whatsoever? And then we go test like, can we make those behaviors happen? And then over time, we see if those behaviors are adding up to anything. But again, to your point, like people aren't software. Um, People, and most of the work we're doing is not, we're not laying bricks one by one inside the organization. It's actually very hard to understand like how our efforts ladder up. And so, yeah, I fully agree. We have to start thinking about more of the human dynamics at work.
I'm totally off of what I want to be doing, which is usually at this time of the podcast talking about you, but I want to stay on this a little bit more. So I want to
Yep.
talk about your organization, Nobel, and I am interested in this idea of that you talk about experimenting, right? Experimenting to, you were just talking about it, experimenting to find what works, which takes trust. Um, in your organization to give you that time and that space to try. Like if this is, first of all, we've got to know where we're going. And then what does it look like when we get there? Why we want to get there. But instead of saying, I know how you're going to get there, right? People are so specific. And I find this with conflict. There's the general things you can talk about conflict, but it's always specific to me, to that person, to our history, my personal history, the organizational structure. And so if we really want to find those durable, actual, long lasting, getting to what we want to go and beyond, it does take, well, what's going to work here and why is it working and what's not getting there? So how did you arrive at thinking about getting to results in that way?
I like a bit of it's but my background. I was a very poor software developer, and I came up at the dawn of Agile and the Agile movement, and just the idea of like let's iterate our way towards solutions and not like be fixated on what the perfect solution to anything could be. Like let's get there faster through like slimmer solutions. And I do think that like Nobel's been around now for about like almost 12 years. And that really was our biggest aha when we started the company. And our biggest difference was just that there are so many things inside organizations from process, rituals, decision making that you can really just prototype and test. And oftentimes clients come to us, like I'm thinking right now, we worked with a big Hollywood studio and they were, suffering trying to catch up to Netflix and Amazon and all these like fast moving studios. And they had a bunch of ideas for things they wanted to try. And I think this is true for most organizations. They had far more ideas than they could ever actually implement, especially at the level of what they had in mind. And they came to us and said, like, oh, we have all these big ideas. And the first thing we want to do is reorg the entire studio into different genres. So people work on like horror, or they work on fantasy, or they work on like kids' films. And we said, okay, that's an interesting idea. I don't know if that's going to work for you, and I don't know if that's going to get you what you want, which is like speed and like more collaboration and better output. So I said, why don't we just test it through a squad? So instead of, like every single person working on the same film, we form a cross-functional team, we give it to like a specific genre, and they tell us what works and what doesn't. And we did that. And what we realized is like, yes, a more cross-functional way of working was best. They were much faster, their output was better, but through doing that work and understand knowing these people more and not just in that like awkward consultant interview where you sit across from me and you're just hoping to get out of the room and like not say anything that'll get you in trouble. We learned that like if they were actually going to reorg the entire studio by genre, no one would want to work there. Because like the whole point is like I get to work on everything. I get to touch a little bit of everything. I don't want to be stuck in my
Mm,
career.
mm,
No one got into it to be like, I just want to work on horror films, right? Like they were like, no, I want to be able to switch up. So we learned so much, and then that process scaled to more and more films as it got smarter and smarter. But those are the things that we look for. Like, what can we change starting next week versus
mm.
like, oh, we need to make a huge investment. We need to move hundreds or thousands of people around to make this possible. I just don't think. I think that almost like 99% of changes can be tested and iterated first before
Mhm.
you try to get to that big, big move that sounds good to shareholders and wrecks most companies.
That's such a wonderful example because you think about these unintended consequences, right? So if you just go like you've got this good goal and you think this is going to meet it, but then if you don't test it and you don't get the kind of, if you think about right change, right, which I know you're interested in, one great way is to the people who are actually using it, what do they think? What works for them? What in that way we get to find out what is the best way to go forward, and you get engagement because you get real feedback instead of you sat on some sort of panel and so there's a smatter, sometimes people, of course, try to get engagement, but what does it really look like to
Yeah.
get people's real input so that you find these sort of real durable solutions you're looking for. All right, so let's
Yeah.
go ahead though. I don't want
No,
to cut
and
you
I was
off.
just gonna say what you also get out of it, which is like to us a little bit of just like an additional bonus, but actually it's the whole game, is just you get less change resistance because people
Yeah,
are actively a part. The change isn't being done to them, it's being done with
right,
them.
right.
And so it's like, classic change management theory plus this sort of new way of making change inside organizations. I mean, that's where sometimes we get asked, like, why is your process this way? And it's like, well, we tried a bunch of other ways. And like ultimately giving some agency to the people inside the organization. And sometimes you have to come in and like there's all different ways that you
Yeah,
have to intervene at times, but mostly like giving people control over how they make the change and where the change goes, as long as we're all agreed on like the direction we want to take things and what success looks like, it's just far more successful than trying to do it any other way.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we got way ahead of ourselves. Where did you go after the gap?
Oh my gosh. So I got really lucky. I got my first computer when I was 10, an Apple IIe. Still lives in my heart, but not and does not work in the real world. And then I was like starting to code pretty soon after that. So I did a lot of like software jobs and things like that. And I was the kid who could like build a computer for you or create a website. And then I fell into after the gap, I went and like was like the head of technology for a VC backed firm when I was still in high school.
Mm.
And it was just at the like the bubble popping, our first bubble, where I was like offered to like not go to college, and then the company didn't exist 3 months later because because it had no business model, and the whole time I was like wondering, how do we make money? Like I haven't quite figured it out yet, but I know you drive traffic. A question mark. It was the underpants gnome business model, which was like the dot-com era. And after that, I studied medieval literature in college because I wanted to stay away from computers for a while, but I fell into publishing and things like that. And then I just ended up at this moment, probably around like my early 20s, where I could walk into like the CEO of Pepsi and tell them about the internet like it was the moon. And like that took off my consulting career, and I've been doing a version of that since. But for a long time, it was sort of this digital wave of the internet will change how you talk to consumers. The internet will change how you make products. Then it was like, well, the internet needs like you need to change the way that you work to be able to keep up with the pace of change that we're seeing that's brought to us by digital. And then I just became obsessed with the people side of change and less the ideas. I just felt after so long of coming into organizations, like the Music Man and like pitching my ideas, which were really the company, like the same people inside the organization had those ideas, but mine were just like my fonts were better, or like my typeface was more artisanal. I just got really tired of doing that. And I just wanted to find context that I could like run into the building and just get the people inside the organization working together as fast as I could. So that's why I started my own company, because I just every other consultant, most of us want to be shiny and we want to seem like we're the smartest kid at the table. And I was just like, I think that's getting in my way of actually making change inside the company.
I really like that. Yeah. When I think about like the work I do, which is in conflict management, and I do lots of training, but I think nothing of what I'm doing is really all that is not really original. I've put it together in a certain kind of way. And the information is, I think, is important, but it's second to the doing of it.
Yeah.
How does this, how, can this person imagine actually having this difficult conversation? Do they have the tools? Do they have the proper support to all the preparation to actually have it? Why are they having it? All of this about setting the individual person up, because it is all about the people. You can have all the ideas, but if the people are resistant for whatever sort of reason, or yeah, I mean, organizations are filled with people, and so we want our people to be healthy and do good things so that they can have individual goals met and department goals and organizational and hopefully societal goals
Yeah, I
met.
love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell us about your business.
So we're Nobel. We're still a small team. That was kind of always the goal. We're a boutique, I think you call us. And yeah, we exist to mostly like we help companies in turnaround, right? Who they've realized, they've got to make some kind of strategic pivot in the market, but strategy ultimately is in the hands of the people inside the organization to act in a new way together. Usually we're their third call after that McKinsey has showed up, or BCG or Deloitte. And they've said, "Hey, we have this 200 slide deck no one knows what to do with. Can you guys help us come in and like shape actual behaviors?" And we built a cool little business with that need. We're usually around for like 8 to 24 months. Like we have very long-term relationships with our clients. And for us, it's just like how do we build enough capability through the process in within the client that we can leave, right? Like turnarounds take 3 to 5 years, like real turnarounds. And so we're there to kind of be the training wheels in the beginning, but mostly to turn it over to the people inside of the company. And then once we see a handful of pilots succeed and scale, then we can go. That they've kind of figured out, a version of our process that whatever version it needs to be for that culture and that context. And then we have enough people who have raised their hands and have gone through an experience with us that we can depart.
So, people listening to this podcast who are thinking about some change that they want to have happen, behavior change, what have you found is, maybe some best practices or tips that you can give, maybe the everyday worker and then maybe a manager or a boss about turning around and getting different behaviors that are long lasting?
I think for like the average employee, and this is just off some research that we've been doing. I mean, like we live in highly cynical times. It's so easy to like see an organization that needs to change, and as an employer to say like this, to throw your hands up and say this place will never change. And I get it. There's lots of reasons in these organizations. Usually they have to try multiple times for it to succeed. Usually people who are like truly cynical in organization have great evidence.
Mhm.
And our argument doesn't beat their evidence. But I would say that it's a fait accompli. Like the more that you as an individual employee embody that sort of skepticism and cynicism, the less likely any sort of change is going to be. And again, like I say, bring the change down, help bring the change down, right? So if you hear leaders talking like in huge slogans about like, oh, we want to be consumer first or we want to be fast, like think about what that really means it to you in your role and what that means at a much smaller scale. Like pick one process and start trying to make change there versus, again, like if you only think at that like 50,000 foot, I think it's very reasonable to be cynical. And then I think for managers, I think the number one problem or the number one like fault I see in a lot of change efforts is communicate first, and they go out with a huge message, and it's all about like what's this like rah story I can tell. It's kind of like putting up like the mission accomplished banner behind you before you've actually made any change on the ground.
Mhm.
And all that really does is increase skepticism and cynicism in the organization. And again, like all I'm trying to do is get people to be open enough to test and try ideas. I don't need them to like, have a religious conversion with me or with the change to begin with, right? And so like normally we're thinking about like how do we start to kick in communications more around like once we have real proof of change. Like once the
Mhm.
first pilots start to succeed, let's go tell that story and have the
Mhm.
people who did the work tell the story. So
Mhm.
yeah, that's the advice. I mean, it's also like go take care of yourself on both like manager and individual employees. Like employees inside companies going through a turnaround, like we have the data, it takes a real toll on your like emotional well-being.
Mhm.
And even like your loved ones, right? Like
Mhm.
like what, the hours it takes at work, the stress it takes at work. So like developing some kind of self-care routine. I know like that can feel soft to a lot of people, but like that, like again, when I say it's a 3 to 5 year process, like it requires that kind of care for yourself if you want to ride that process out.
Mhm. I just think that's realistic. People want change and they want it right now. Well, that's wonderful, but that's typically not what happens when you are, when you're changing a culture, you're turning things around. It is, you got to be in it for the long haul. I really like what you said about cynicism is that a lot of times, we want to write it off. That's in the past. That was then. But I think that's wrong-headed. I mean, it was in the past, or it is something that happened, but recognizing it, yeah, that happened. And what I try to do is, I think that in conflict, you can't just turn a blind eye to the past. You've got to acknowledge it. But then the question is this and what's next, right? So, yeah, this happened. What do you want your story to be the rest of today and tomorrow? What is it that you want while you're here at this organization and for your own life? What kind of work conditions do you want? And this happened, or these series of things happened to you or within the organization that have given you this outlook. That's good information. Now, the question is, well, what do you want? And therefore, what are you going to do? And I think when the individual changes that narrative, then they can do what you just said instead of thinking, I'm all the way up here at the very top looking down. Okay, what's the one thing that I want to focus on? And then now we've got agency again, and I'm actively working for my own good and the good of the people in my organization. Um,
Yeah. I
yeah,
was just thinking as I was answering you, like how much you must see this come up in
mm,
conflict. Like
yeah,
to your point about turning a blind eye and how much that doesn't allow the processing that needs to
mhm,
happen
yeah,
to be able to move forward. So I fully agree. Yeah, like have that picture of where you want to go next, but unless you, say it plainly what happened, right? Like people
yeah,
can't move on with you.
yeah. Say it plainly, naming the elephant, so it's not an elephant. This happened. What is complicated, of course, is that many times people don't agree as to what happened or what is the significance of what happened. Like we were all in the same meeting, but we all didn't see the same thing. It didn't feel the same way. It didn't have the same kind of significance. And I think being able to have space for that, what is your experience? Why did this impact you negatively or positively? And sitting with that and then deciding, okay, now what are we going to do next? And, having mental health options and all the different sorts of ways in which when somebody feels like they really have been harmed, what extra kind of care do they need? And, looking at those packages and really encouraging people to take advantage of those so that, mental health days or whatever it might be to take care of ourselves for whether or not we're staying in this organization or going someplace else, right? This human aspect of what happens at work. We're going to have conflicts. We're going to have bad things happen to us. We're going to have breaks in relationships and all the good things that are going to happen as well. We can find such wonderful, meaningful relationships and work and accomplish a lot of things that, personally that we want to try to accomplish with our life.
Yeah, I think we fool ourselves sometimes, but based on the research that we've done, like work is one of the last places of community, especially in the US.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes we underplay the value of work, or it's a complicated picture because it is our
Mhm.
financial, means. We also want to be able to see ourselves as someone who can like, up and leave a role or get a new role or get a better job. But it is one of the last places of community for us, right? And those relationships matter. And like a bad meeting with someone can truly upset you.
Yeah,
Um, and a lot of folks like to downplay that or not like to focus on it. And I think that that just ends up like burying those needs and those feelings, which is just, again, it just creates more festering conflict down the road.
absolutely. So, Bud, when you think about your history of work and you think about maybe your younger self, how did you deal with conflict at work? And do you have any conflicts that you would want to share, or just how you dealt with it versus how you would deal with it now if it has changed?
I think like for young employees like me, like it has so much I don't know if I'm curious what you think about this, but it has so much to do with like your family of origin. Like my family loves conflict. Like we are the most open about conflict family that you'll ever find. Like we snipe, like we, if someone does something, we just call it out immediately. We're that sort of family, which it took me a long time to realize that like that's not the norm.
It is not.
And so most of my conflicts early in my career were like I would happily jump into conflict with people and I would argue with people in the room and not realize the political game that was actually occurring.
Yeah.
I can remember like I was hired to come in and be a change agent in a big advertising industry before I was a consultant. And and I openly disagreed with someone who was like 2 levels higher than me. And I was like, no, I don't think that's a great idea. I think like actually you should do this. And it created so much strife and there were like so many hurt feelings.
Mhm.
And I found myself having to like sit in a room with someone who was like 2 decades older than me and who like was like, and I was still arguing the point in the room, and they were arguing the power, and I could not understand it. I think that was
Yeah.
like my hardest thing for me to understand was like the political environment of work.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've made that mistake a lot. And as I've gotten older, I think I've realized that like still one of my mistakes is like I lean into conflict. I love debating strategy. I love debating ideas, but I often forget to repair
Mm,
afterwards. Right. And again, like I've come to understand that like what I see as like healthy conflict can feel threatening to other people.
mhm,
I don't like to yell and things like that, but I can get worked up about ideas,
mhm.
but I'll forget to close the loop with someone like the next day and say like, "Hey, yesterday was really active. Like, how are you feeling about it? Like, do you feel like I stepped on or crossed any lines? Like I like my relationship, like
Mhm.
even just saying like, "Hey, my relationship with you matters." Like I can sometimes forget to do that because I'm moving at 1,000 miles an hour. And most of the time when I've had interpersonal conflict at work, it's because I forgot to check back in.
Mhm.
And like 95% of the time, I don't actually need to say I'm sorry. I just literally need to do the check-in.
Mhm.
And then people are like, oh, we're good then. But I tend to forget that. I'm like, I have to relearn that lesson like every 8 months, which is so fun.
All right, isn't that a wonderful lesson?
Yeah.
You know, that's such a good reminder. My experience for myself and most of the people that I see in organizations, they're conflict averse, whether they're your run-of-the-mill, ordinary employee or they are up the rung. And it's problematic, especially the higher up you go, and if you're unwilling to deal with conflict or it makes you feel uncomfortable. But it is such a good reminder that, you know, how we think about the right way to deal with conflict, or even what is a conflict, differs. I love talking about ideas. I was just talking to a friend, some philosopher by trade. My husband's a philosopher, and I was talking to his best friend, who is a literature professor. And he said something like, you philosophers, we say something like, I don't understand that. And it's like, basically, he was saying, in polite conversation, people don't do that, Mary. You know, like people don't just, and I'm like, what? What are you talking about? Like, well, I didn't understand your point. I understand what you're talking about. And that is just, my husband for 30 years. I mean, like, philosophy is baked into the way I don't even think about it as confrontational, right? Now, if it's an interpersonal thing, that's a different issue for me, right? So,
I
but
just got in trouble about that though. Like my wife is Australian, so we don't get back all the time to see her family. And we were in Australia recently and we were at dinner with her brother. And I said, so what about you guys when you were kids really annoyed you of each other? And like within a second in unison, they both went, oh, we don't talk about that. And I was like, and I tried to relate it to my brother and sister, and I was like, they just said they wouldn't talk about it. My brother and sister were like, we love talking about that. And my wife was like, no, that's conflict. We don't want to do that. And I was like, oh, that's just fun. So it's like, like people do have wildly different definitions of like what a conflict is. Uh, but
Yeah.
again, it's one of those things that like you lived in a bubble,
Yeah.
until you like were out in the broader world. And half the time, to your point about like people are conflict averse, like that's the one thing that robs you when you aren't in conflict is like you don't get to understand how other people's minds work, and you don't
Yeah.
get to understand like the full box of crayons that other people come in terms
Hmm.
of like how they view things. So it is tough when you are in environments that are very conflict averse.
Yeah. When you are in a work environment, I always tell people, if you feel like you're walking on eggshells, that's there are all these red flags for things that are going wrong. Gossiping, huge red flag. Walking on eggshells, red flag. Because if we want engagement, if we want collaboration within the team or across, we need to be able to talk with one another. But if I'm in active conflict with somebody, why am I going to want to meet with them, talk with them, work with them, and then once trust erodes and breaks, right? There's all of these dynamics. And so we have had conflict in the past. We might be in it right now. It's guaranteed we'll have it in the future. So the question is not if we will have it, it's when and how to disagree well. And because disagreeing well is so important for the business, right? For the business of work, my personal goals, the group's goals, on and on. We need to be able to hear different ideas because you're great, I'm great, but our ideas together are even better, right? And we
Yeah.
can check each other. I mean, there's just so much there, but people skirt around it, don't want to deal with it because the heaviness of emotions, right? These things that we're sometimes told to check at the door. But, workplaces need to be more human because we're there anyway. And if we
Yeah.
don't recognize it, it's negatively impacting our work.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. I mean, a couple things came up for me there. It's like one, the whole reason why we measure employee engagement at work is because like we want passion, we want emotions so that people work more. Right? Like that's the logic to it, but then we're like, but not those other emotions, right? It's like as if you can really only pick up one emotion at a time. And then like when you talked about red flags, for me, what's a red flag about conflict and what's in the room, what's not in the room. Like we talk a lot about like foreground and background conversations. Foreground is like what can come up in the room when you're with other people, but background's like when you leave the room and you find your confidant and you're like, can you believe they said that? It's
Mhm.
when strategy discussions start getting into the background where you're not even like raising ideas in the room anymore, or like you see holes in ideas, but you're like, I'm not gonna say like who's gonna say something? Who's gonna be the first person to say it and get dinged for it? Like
Yeah,
that to me is like the most critical red flag.
yeah.
And that's how we know that there's like truly an intervention needed to go like rebuild trust, rebuild collaboration within teams.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of times people, want to, they want me to come in and help them get rid of their conflict. I'm like, well, it's not possible and it's not good. Like, that's not what you want. We need to be able to, we want to hear all the voices. We want to hear what's really going on. And that means, the idea of psychological safety. So people will speak up
Yeah.
without fear of retribution. How do you get that? And the disconnect between what the leader thinks is going on and what's really going on. How do you help leaders? Many times leaders think, "Oh no, people are showing up. They are saying." And then you hear the people that are being led and they're like, "No."
I mean, there's just the basic consulting job sometimes of like, yeah, you go and you do some listening and you bring that back to leaders just to say, like, I know that you will know some of this, but you won't know all of this, and I guarantee you haven't acted on much of it.
Mhm.
That's something that we do. But we also, like, again, like for the background foreground conversations, because right, the loop you're stuck in is like, no, if no one's raising it, then you can't know it. We actually
Right.
play a little game sometimes with teams who are like so timid to share things where we're like, let's just first just like in really small pairs, name all the foreground conversations, then start to just like not even get into it, but just give me a name for some background conversations. And then
Yeah.
like, well, let's build on that. Like what, and then like, let's not own the statement yet. Like what gets said sometimes in background conversations and kind of like move them up safely on that ladder. But I'm also watching their leader the whole time and
Mhm.
looking at like what kind of body language are they signaling? I think
Mhm.
a lot of leaders I've coached, that is something they don't pay attention to. They'll say like, I want everyone to be innovative and I've hired all these really smart people. And then you watch them in a room and when something they don't like, they look down or they roll their eyes at people. Um, it's just like, your feelings betray you.
Yeah.
And it's just, again, it's one of those like bigger challenges about being a leader. Like you have to be mindful of what sort of message you're giving implicitly or explicitly in the room. But yeah, it's a really difficult thing, and you kind of have to. I'm sure you see this too. Like you kind of have to try it multiple times. The first
Hmm.
time is not going to be great. The second time can even be worse.
Hmm.
And then you have to build that muscle up again.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think about the different generations at work, what do you see as the great opportunities there, and what are organizations struggling with?
I'm really curious about your thoughts there. I mean, like every single company we go into, someone grabs us and they're like, "Can you believe these Gen Z employees?" Or like you'll find someone who's like, someone else will be like, "These boomers just need to get out of here." And there's so much like there's like generational warfare happening. What I find really like I find this really fascinating because like as we've done all of this research and all of this data collection, and what we find is like there are slight differences in generations, but they're not nearly what people think they are. But like the media loves a good story about it, right? And there was a time even I think like 2016 where our clients were like, "You guys should be the millennial whisperers at work," and I was like, please no. Like we often, I don't know if you feel this way, but I feel like we often mistake like life stage for generational issues, right? Like I'm a millennial, I'm an old millennial, but I'm a millennial, and I remember everyone was like, "Well, they don't want to ever own a car or they don't want to own a home." I'm like, "No, we're broke." I'm like in my late 20s and I'm broke and everything's expensive. Um, it doesn't mean I've changed my relationship with possessions. It just means that like those things are out of my control. So like people are starting new businesses where I can like Airbnb and things like that. That's now interesting to me because that's accessible to me. So, so oftentimes I find that we're stuck kind of demystifying those perspectives of people. And
Mhm.
also I just think with remote work and hybrid work, like, we make villains out of a lot of different people at work. And it's easier to now than being stuck in a room with someone and having to actually like get to know their full three-dimensional self. I don't know. What do you think about generations at work?
Yeah, I just wrote a book that just came out a month ago called Winning the
Congrats.
Generation Wars at Work, Making Your Age an Asset. And I was in the middle of writing a different book about conflict, like how to have a basic conflict conversation. But that's exactly what would happen every place I would go. But it would mostly would be the person that hired me said, "How am I supposed to work with these young people? They have no work ethic. They're snowflakes. They're, whatever derogatory thing we'd want to say." But it was really more like help. What do I do? Like how do I work with them? They're asking for these accommodations. They're asking, work-life balance. And it was really like it wasn't an eye rolling. It was really like I don't know what to do with these people. They are these aliens. And so I myself, I'm pretty much an existentialist individualist, and I just see individual people. And yet, of course, there's something to the stage of life that you're in. There's something to the economics in which you were raised in, and like what's going on in the culture at large as you progress through life. So yes, and I see it on both ends, and then people also in the middle. And I'm very interested in just getting people together to have dialogue, because proximity takes away a lot of this villain hero scenario.
Mm.
It is very, you can't really work with a villain because we've decided they're a certain way, because I did have this negative experience. So recognizing that I had this negative experience, but then asking, why was it negative? What expectations did they not meet? That was my expectation. What do I imagine their expectation was? How were they onboarded? Like starting to get really curious about whatever narrative I have spun, no matter where you are, so that we could all be going in the same direction. What are our goals? And so how are we going to meet those? And how are we going to arrange work for 2026 and then the next year, 2027? Because we'll get the alphas in here. I mean, everything is always going to be shifting, and we're always going to be aging, and part will be going out and part will be coming in. So aging proof your organization is, I think, having these ongoing dialogues so that, and technology is a big one, right? How do we how do we incorporate technology so that we don't have the digital divide, which is changing, but we still don't have those into the future, and there's just so many different things that we can do if we stop and have conversations so that we can have healthy work environments.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, one of my favorite things recently is like Mark Zuckerberg complaining about his employees being like, "Where do these people get off?" And you like rewind the clock back a decade, Mark. You invented this culture. Like Facebook invented the idea of like we always listen to our employees. He held like an AMA every Friday and shared every decision he was making. Facebook was like one of the pioneers in the like we don't just offer benefits. It's like a cruise line. You have accommodations at work, like because we don't want you to leave.
Right.
And so it's just like it's so ironic that we find ourselves here. And again, if
Mhm.
you look at the great continuum of generations, like yes, there was a generation who was told like your feelings don't have a role here. This isn't about like psych safety meant something much different. Like you're not going to get fired likely for saying like, hey, that's about to explode. But those people also got a pension and got loyalty like for
Mhm.
decades of work. And now we live in this other like complete opposite end where they're like the social contract is completely broken, but you have to treat me like a human now, right? Like those are the exchanges that we've made, and we're all sort of in the middle of that transition.
Yeah.
And I think there's so much more that like our different generations can like see and recognize in each other. And I love that you bring them together because I think prejudice can't really survive contact unless there's incentive structures in place
Yeah.
to keep that prejudice in place.
Yeah, and there are, these systems that, what do you get for seniority? What is your role? Who gets to speak at the table and why? And so sometimes there's these systemic issues that are contributing this polarization, right? But if we don't look at what's going on in the systems, if we don't look at the people in front of us and, well, what do these people want right now? What makes sense for what we're trying to do, where we're trying to go? Having all those just but those constant conversations, because people are coming in and going out. And if we're thinking about culture, good culture, I think only comes about through sustained intentionality, right? So sustained intentional conversations about expectations, about when I say work-life balance, what the heck do I mean? When I say a good work ethic, when I think reasonable accommodations, like, uh, you know, defining those things. Not that everything is a compromise, but if you don't know, you don't know what somebody else's expectation is, and then we can have real conversations about it.
Yeah, I fully agree. And even for this is something that we've made for ourselves, and then we found ourselves doing this with other clients. Like we create what we call a culture contract, which is just to spell out like some basics of like, here's what we as an employer owe you. Here's what you as an employer owe us. And here's what happens when you feel like there's been an infraction one way or the other, right? And just keep it like not in high, lofty language, but like, you know, for us as a company too, part of that was just to say to employees like, you have the responsibility to invest in your own career, right? And like to be the captain of your own ship in that way. Like you need to know where you want to grow and like we'll help you and we'll be in conversation with you to talk about like how we can do that and what we can provide along the way. But unless you know, for example, that how you want to grow, like we can't know that for you. And just like and I think ours is like 1 page long. We've done it for other companies that are like big public companies that are like 4 pages long. But again, it's like let's get some basic agreements on paper that we talk about from time to time, but as part of the onboarding process for all new hires, just so we level set for everyone what that means and what work-life balance means. As a consulting company, work-life balance is something that's very important to me, but we all know there are like crunch times. And like, let's talk about how many crunches per year we really think you should expect versus like this is the norm, which is what we don't want to get into.
Right. Yeah, but that's such a great idea, setting those expectations. I do something kind of similar. I call it employee value propositions,
Yeah.
So a lot of times we have those values that are external facing, what is the organization about? But what are those 3 to 5 values of, how you are expected to treat one another and how you can expect to be treated? But that really important piece, what do I do when there's a violation? So we have to be clear about, it's one thing to have those values or the contract, but specifically, what does that mean? So many times without spelling that out or knowing what to do, I feel like somebody's being a bully, but really maybe they're not being a bully. They are a loud talker. And as they get more and more animated. And so that person doesn't have the belief that they're being a bully, let's say, Well, the other person might have it. So what do we do next? How do we nip that in the bud so that so some sort of narrative doesn't take root and grow so that, if we said we're not going to treat each other in like a bulldozer kind of way, I feel like I'm being bulldozed. Okay, well, that's not my intent. Or, how do we have those conversations? But you've got to train people and expect them to have it, or largely they won't.
Yeah, I love that.
Unless they
And
were
I,
raised like you.
well, again, I mean, we love conflict, but we're not the best at repair, like I said. I mean, I think, like hardly I've ever been in an organization where there wasn't conflict in the middle that I couldn't trace back up to the C-suite somewhere. And I think oftentimes that like the leaders of these companies are some of the most risk averse people when it comes to interpersonal conflict. I mean, like I work with CEOs who will go on live on CNBC and debate their quarterly results or, will go raise millions of dollars from VCs, but they won't have a tough conversation with one of their direct reports. So I think it's like, we've turned CEOs into superheroes, but like they lack the same, you know, courage that the rest of us do at times, and that
Yeah.
just ends up trickling down. So I think that's a challenge too.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes conflict so difficult is because it is about these interpersonal relationships. And we trick ourselves in thinking that conflict is about something external, it's about this issue, but it isn't. It's about who I am and who you are and this web of belief and relationships. And if I tug on this one, what's going to happen? If I tug on that one, what's going to happen? I can just take it and not go into the unknown of what if I try to have a conversation with you and then you roll your eyes at me, or behind my back, you go talk to this person and now I'm in trouble, or, being called petty or high maintenance or someone
Hmm.
who can't solve their own problems. There's all these sorts of narratives that we tell ourselves so that we catastrophize about what might happen instead of thinking about, but what if it goes well? Maybe my loved one doesn't have to hear about this anymore. Maybe I can leave it and do something else.
I think that like one of the wisest things anyone ever said to me is that like once a conflict becomes repetitive, like that dynamic almost has its own life, right? And it
Mhm.
almost becomes its own beast and its own animal. And like
Mhm.
you can also start to just name it in the room. Like so you don't even have to get into like the thing that you talked about, right? Like it's not like, oh, like we disagree about taste. It's like you don't have to even get there or like, oh, I don't like you. You can just be like, here's that thing again. Here it is again in the room. How do we want to tackle it this time? Because like the thing that I drives me nuts and I point to is like, let's just not end up in the same cold stack like 15 times. Like
Mhm.
that just sounds like no one's going to enjoy that. No one thinks
Mhm.
that that's a good day. And to your point, like sometimes my bar for our work is like, yeah, people don't go home and have a bad home evening, right? Like where they pick a fight with their significant other because they couldn't have the right fight at work.
Mhm.
So I think that's just to name the dynamic of like, it's in the room right now. What do we want to do?
Mhm. Yeah. And I love that because, people have real feelings and people are in all different places emotionally, with their ability to move on or move forward. But if you have a team member that's having a difficulty or someone who just won't let something go, a lot of times that will just stop a team. They're the dam, and now we can't move forward because they're holding the river. And we can still decide to treat that person with respect and invite them to move forward. And um, if they don't, but how do we move around them and hopefully invite them to come along the journey? But a lot of times it's those obstructionists who are going round and round about this thing that just then people don't want to meet because they don't want to do this anymore and they don't want the volatility or whatever might happen. And then they're just kind of sitting there until somebody does something, whatever that may be, or somebody leaves.
Yeah, and it's so tough because
Yeah.
there's fear, and oftentimes they have to go do some personal work that we just, I don't have a responsibility for in the
Yeah.
room, and it's tough. It's tough to watch someone who gets so arrested by that conflict that they fall behind and the organization has to make that tough decision. Like this person can't move forward. It's very, very difficult.
It is hard. Well, Bud, our time is almost up, but I want to ask you this last question. When you look into the future of work, what do you think needs to happen so that not only will all people be treated with dignity and respect, but that they will be encouraged to thrive and flourish?
It's hard not to answer that question with AI in mind right now. And the way, like, I think the number one problem I see is that we are framing AI as conflict, as like like against software.
Mm,
And I think that like truly bad things can happen as we do that as a society, right? Like, as we start to wonder, I know like exec teams are sitting around wondering, like, do we need all these people now? Like, can't we get software to do this for us? And then so many, like, if you think about the experience of being an Uber driver right now, or a Lyft driver, or someone who works for Instacart, like they work for an algorithm. And I think that like that's the beginning of a much bigger trend where like
mm,
we're going to be assigned what work to do. We're going to be evaluated based on these algorithms. I've already heard of like mass layoffs here in San Francisco that were designed by an algorithm,
mm,
and people were chosen by that. So I think that like just the idea of like I work under the algorithm or I work against the software, I think is like where I feel like we're all just driving off a cliff as fast as we can. And in order for humans to really flourish at work, we got to start thinking about like this cooperative nature of technology, but we also have to start like building it. Like I just don't see a lot of solutions in the world right now that are like even the basic thing of like how about some software that tells me like when I'm working on the same thing someone else is inside the company and it like connects us or it like stops us from working on unnecessary work? Like where's
mm,
the things that like would like actually solve my pain points as a person and not like a manager's pain points of like how much overhead do I have? So
mm,
that's what I'm like if I like as I'm in boardrooms and things like that right now, I'm trying to stop that like antagonism that we are seeing between software and human beings because ultimately I mean Henry Ford knew this, like if you don't have employees who can buy your products you don't have an economy.
mhm.
And he wasn't exactly the most enlightened human being on the planet but he understood that. So that's where I'm focused on in the AI conversations right now.
Mm. So making AI work for us. So I mean, like how would you sum that up? I mean, I think it's really interesting. So AI that is helping us collaborate instead of being like a overlord, sort of what
Yeah,
is
I think
being
about it like
pitched.
back to like plain old theory X theory Y, of management, right? Like that was the idea that you either think that like employees are lazy and they need to be controlled, or you think that like actually people are creative and want to do a good job. It's not actually that like one of those is more right than the other. The idea was basically like you get the workforce
Right.
that you
You
think
just
about, right? Like
right.
if you treat people like they're lazy and they need to be controlled, they tend to fall to your level of expectations
Right.
and vice versa. So I think about like, okay, are we designing tools that treat people like Theory Y, where it's
Mhm.
not bossware, it's not like right now, Microsoft Copilot will tell your organization what percent of people like how often they're moving their mouse and stuff like that. Like
Oh
these
gosh.
these are the first use cases that engineers are thinking about building for, and I think that we need to think about like how do we inspire more creativity? How do we inspire better collaboration? To your point about like I am sitting all day with this computer. It knows a lot about me, but when like interact with people on a flat Zoom or Team screen, they make a bunch of assumptions about me. There's ways software could like beat up those assumptions, right? And help people actually manage that conflict and prepare for conflict. But that's not the first thing we're building. We're doing surveillance. That's what we've chosen to do.
Terrible. It's so anti-human. It's so anti-creative and collaborative and building relationships at work so that individually we can be fulfilled and do good work in our organization. So yeah, that's great. That's
Yeah.
wonderful. Thank
Let's
you.
just build a future where humans are still in it. Let's do that.
I always say technology is for us, we're not for it. So that's what we need
Yeah.
to, yeah,
Come out
gotta.
here in San Francisco and we'll get a billboard together. Yeah.
That sounds good. Well, but thank you so much for your time. I just so enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, I've loved it. Thanks so much, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you for being on Conflict Managed. It was a real pleasure talking with you and the work that you're doing for over a decade to help people have better work environments. I really appreciate your perspective, your work on cynicism, and your outlook on AI. Very important. So thank you for taking time to be on Conflict Managed. Conflict Managed is produced by third-party workplace conflict restoration services and hosted by me, Mary Brown. You can find us online at 3pconflictrestoration.com. Come back. We have new episodes every Tuesday if you would like, and subscribe wherever you are watching or listening to this. It'd be much appreciated. If you'd like to check out my new book, Winning the Generation Wars at Work, Making Your Age an Asset, is available on Amazon. And, how do we get along with those other people? Have a relatively simple, practical solution. So I hope that book will help you. Our music is courtesy of Dove Pilot. And remember, conflict is normal and expected. Let's deal with it. Until next time, take care.